Listen to this episode and more on Spotify. The mid-20th century, the century of innovation, from commercial, residential, war, and medical. Medicine has come a long way since the 1990s, with technology getting better developed, like the X-ray machine from Marie Curie. Penicillin and vaccines continue to get better. But not all of the new medicinal ideas have been great. In fact, one of the worst medical treatments ever done that we are talking about today actually won a Nobel Prize for its revolutionary achievements in medicine. But as time went on, and more was learned about the human body, humanity began to find out what they rewarded. It became one of the worst medical treatments in the world. Hello everyone, my name is Juby Scott, and today we are looking into one of humanity's biggest mistakes, and the most famous case of somebody getting one done, and how big the case became once the word got out. Yes, we are talking about the lobotomy of Rosemary Kennedy, someone who had their life completely changed with a simple cut. So strap in, turn off the lights, and enjoy this episode of Juby After Dark. Before we get into Rosemary, we will look briefly into what a lobotomy is. In the early 20th century, the number of patients residing in mental hospitals had started to skyrocket. With such a rapid increase, there was little in ways to effectively treat these. Shock therapy was the biggest one, where they could simply shock the patient's head in hopes to reset your brain to cure whatever was ailing you. Leech therapy, where they'd hope to suck the mental illness out of you. Or sleep therapy, where you would be put into a coma for days or even weeks in hopes of getting the craziness out of your body. Of course, all these treatments do nothing for mental health, as we know now. But medicine was like the Wild West at the time, trying to see what worked. Along came Inez Moniz, with his partner John Fulton. To keep this story short, they both experimented on chimps and performed a raw version of what would soon be called a lobotomy on two chimps. Following the surgical removal of their frontal lobes, the behavior of both primates changed remarkably, and Becky was pacified to such a degree, one of the chimps, that Jacobson, the chimp's owner, apparently stated it was as if she had joined a happiness cult. During the question and answer section of the paper, Moniz is alleged startled Fulton by inquiring if this procedure might be extended to human subjects suffering from mental illness. Fulton stated that he replied that while possible in theory, it was surely too formidable an intervention for use on humans. Inez's surgery was not technically a lobotomy, but actually what is called a lobotomy. The difference being that they would still cut the area of the frontal lobe, but they had to drill a 6 centimeter size hole in your skull first. When the lobotomy was brought over to the United States, James Watts would evolve it. Instead of drilling into the skull, he would simply use an ice pick through the eye sockets. But that's a story for another time. Let us head back to Rosemary Kennedy, where she had the lobotomy. During the birthing process of Rosemary, her mother Rose, Kennedy's doctor, was not available at the time to help with the birth due to the Spanish flu pandemic. Therefore, she was ordered by the nurse to keep her legs closed for 2 hours, keeping Rosemary's head in the birth canal. This caused a severe lack of oxygen to the brain. As Rosemary began to grow, her parents noticed she was not reaching the basic developmental steps a human normally reaches at a certain month or year. At 2 years old, she had a hard time sitting up, crawling, and learning to walk. Her family would try their hardest to pretend that Rosemary was developing normally, but she was having trouble learning to read and write. Even with tutors, she was then sent to a boarding school for people with intellectual disabilities at age 11. By 1940, Rosemary returned to the US after spending time in the UK. She became increasingly irritable and difficult at the age of 22. Kennedy would often experience convulsions and fly into violent rages, during which she would hit and injure others. Kennedy was sent to a convent school in Washington, D.C., and began starting to sneak out of the convent school at night. The nuns at the convent thought that Rosemary might be involved with sexual partners, and that she could contract a sexually transmitted disease or become pregnant. Her occasionally erratic behavior frustrated her parents. Her father, Joe Kennedy, was especially worried that Kennedy's behavior would shame and embarrass the family and damage his and his children's political careers. When Kennedy was 23 years old, doctors told her father that a lobotomy would help calm her mood swings and stop her occasional violent outbursts. Joe Sr. decided that Rosemary should have a lobotomy. However, he did not inform his wife in this decision until after the procedure was completed. The procedure took place in November 1941. James Watts and Walter Freeman, his assistant at the time, described the procedure as follows. After Rosemary was mildly sedated, we went through the top of the head, Dr. Watts recalled. I think she was awake. She had a mild tranquilizer. I made a surgical incision in the brain through the skull. It was near the front. It was on both sides. We just made a small incision, no more than an inch. The instrument Dr. Watts used looked like a butter knife. He swung it up and down to cut brain tissue. We put an instrument inside, he said. As Dr. Watts cut, Dr. Freeman asked Rosemary, for example, to recite the Lord's Prayer or sing God Bless America, or count backwards. We tried to estimate, thus, how far to further cut, based on how Rosemary responded. When she became incoherent, they ceased cutting. Rosemary soon became paralyzed and unresponsive. While she was still very much alive, it was almost like she was in a zombie state. After months of physical therapy, she was able to control one of her arms again and couldn't use the bathroom on her own anymore. Joe Kennedy would also not claim that Rosemary was mentally ill, instead using a more discriminant word, as this was to protect John F. Kennedy's presidential run. It was quickly apparent that the procedure had caused immense harm. Kennedy's mental capacity diminished to that of a 2-year-old child. She could not walk or speak intelligibly and was incontinent. After the lobotomy, Kennedy was immediately institutionalized. She initially lived for several years at Craig House, a private psychiatric hospital 90 minutes north of New York City. Her father then traveled to and built a private house for her, which was designed for adults who needed lifelong care. He hired 2 nuns to take care of her, calling it the Kennedy Cottage. Joe Kennedy had a car that could be used to take her for rides and a dog, which she could take on walks. In response to her condition, Kennedy's parents separated her from her family. Rose Kennedy did not visit her for 20 years. Joe Sr. did not visit his daughter at the institution at all. None of her siblings knew of her whereabouts. While her older brother John was campaigning for re-election to the U.S. Senate in 1958, the Kennedy family explained away her absence by claiming she was reclusive. The family did not publicly explain her absence until 1961, after John had been elected president. The Kennedys did not reveal that she was institutionalized because of a failed lobotomy, but instead said that she was deemed mentally delayed. Joe said something more vulgar, but it's 2024 and I don't think social would approve of the word to this day. In 1961, after Joe Sr. had a stroke that left him unable to speak and walk, Rosemary's siblings were made aware of her location. Rosemary's condition was revealed publicly by her sister Eunice in a 1962 interview to the Saturday Evening Post. But her lobotomy did not become public knowledge until 1987, when historian Doris Keens Goodwin revealed it in her book, The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys. Following her father's death in 1969, the Kennedys gradually involved Rosemary in family life again. She was occasionally taken to visit relatives in Florida and Washington, D.C., as well as her childhood home on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. By that time, Rosemary had learned to walk again, but did so with a limp. She never regained the ability to speak clearly, and her arm was paralyzed. Her condition is sometimes credited to the inspiration for Eunice Kennedy Shriver to later found the Special Olympics. Kennedy died from natural causes on January 7, 2005, age 86, at the Fort Atkinson Memorial Hospital in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, with her siblings, sisters Jean, Eunice, and Patricia, and her brother Ted by her side. She was buried beside her parents at Holyhood Cemetery in Brooklyn, Massachusetts. Thank you guys so much for watching / listening to this episode of Juby After Dark. If you are enjoying the show, why don't you go ahead and smack a like on this video for me? Or if you're listening on the podcast, go ahead and hit that follow button so you can catch on the new episode next month. If you are enjoying this content and you want to help support the channel, go ahead and check the description. There is a link to my Patreon below. Anything helps, and please do not feel obligated. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.